What if everything you've been taught about morality, success, and power is wrong? What if the rules we follow to win in life are actually a game set up so that the few dominate and the majority remain naive? This thought may seem uncomfortable, but centuries ago, one man warned about it: Nicholas Machiavelli. His teachings were demonized, his image transformed into that of a calculating villain, and his name became synonymous with betrayal and manipulation. But was he really evil incarnate, or just one of the few who dared to reveal the hidden cogs of power? Machiavelli didn't create the rules of the game. He merely exposed them. Born in a time when alliances were sealed with blood and promises were broken before the ink was even dry, he witnessed the rise and fall of rulers, saw traitors hanged in public squares, and understood something that few want to admit. The world is not ruled by kindness, but by cunning and force. Contrary to what many people think, The Prince was not a book written for the public, but rather a practical guide for a ruler to maintain his power at any cost. Machiavelli, exiled and with no hope of returning to politics, offered this manual to the Medici, the family that destroyed him, as a desperate attempt to regain his position. But ironically, his work has become timeless, studied to this day by leaders, CEOs, and strategists. But what makes his ideas so controversial? Simple. He didn't romanticize human nature. For Machiavelli, we are not creatures driven by morality, but by interests and fear. And that's why his teachings, far from being just about politics, are a manual for anyone who wants to understand how the world really works. Now, let's dive into his mind. We'll explore the uncomfortable truths he revealed, and above all, how we can use this knowledge to better navigate life and power. But before we can learn to win, we need to see the world as it really is. From a young age, we are taught to believe that the world rewards the good, punishes the bad, and that justice always prevails. But when we grow up, we are faced with a brutally different reality. The world is not fair. Power does not belong to the most virtuous, but to those who understand how it works and know how to manipulate it. Machiavelli realized this living in Florence, a city where the appearance of democracy hid a corrupt system dominated by the Medici. He saw rulers deposed, alliances broken, and executions serving as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the established order. He understood that morality was not a determining factor in the game of power, but rather the ability to read the situation and act strategically. This became even clearer when Machiavelli was sent as a diplomat to negotiate with powerful figures of the time, including the feared Cesare Borgia. Cesare was the son of Pope Alexander VI and had a single objective: to consolidate a kingdom of his own within Italy. His method? Force, treachery, and manipulation. In one of his campaigns, Cesare Borgia conquered the city of Cesena and appointed a brutal governor, Ramiro de Lorca, to maintain order. Lorca imposed a regime of terror, with summary executions and extreme punishments. When Cesare realized that the population was beginning to hate him, he did something unexpected. He had his own governor executed in a public square and declared that the atrocities had been the work of Lorca alone. The people, relieved, came to admire Cesare as a just leader. Machiavelli witnessed all this and drew an essential conclusion. People are not guided by the truth, but by their perception of reality. Cesare was not morally good or just, but he knew how to manipulate events to make himself appear so. This is the first great Machiavellian lesson. The world is not guided by absolute moral values, but by interests, force, and perception. If this thought seems cruel, think about the world today. How many politicians win power based on exciting speeches, but govern with hidden interests? How many companies build brands that appear ethical, while behind the scenes, they exploit their employees or harm the environment? How many people in their daily lives pretend to be kind, but act out of pure self-interest? The truth is that those who insist on seeing the world as they would like it to be become easy prey for those who understand it as it really is. And that brings us to an essential question. If the world doesn't follow moral rules, then what are the real rules of the game? Is this content making you reflect and sparking new ways of thinking? If so, click the super thanks button just below the video. It's a way to say thank you and help me bring more content like this to those who need to reflect on life. History is full of brilliant men who failed and incompetent men who made it to the top. Why? Machiavelli believed that this was due to two factors: virtue and fortune. But these concepts go far beyond what they seem at first glance. Virtue, in Machiavelli's thinking, has nothing to do with moral virtue. Instead, it represents the ability to act with intelligence, cunning, and determination to shape one's own destiny. Fortune, on the other hand, is the unpredictable factor. Luck, the external events that can lift or bring down anyone at any time. The question is, how much can we control our destiny, and how much are we at the mercy of luck? Machiavelli was not a theorist isolated from reality. He saw for himself how fortune could raise and destroy men in the blink of an eye. When the Medici were overthrown and Florence became a republic, Machiavelli rose rapidly. He became one of the most important figures in Florentine diplomacy, negotiating with great European leaders. But his rise didn't last long. In 1512, fortunes turned. The Medici returned to power, and anyone who had served the Republic was considered an enemy. Machiavelli was arrested, tortured, and exiled. In a matter of months, he went from one of the most influential men in Florence to a political pariah. This experience reinforced his view: no matter how skilled you are, if you don't know how to deal with the whims of fortune, you will be crushed. If Machiavelli had a political hero, it was Cesare Borgia. He considered him a living example of how virtue can bend fortune. Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, was a born strategist. Combining brutal force, manipulation, and intelligence, he conquered territories and eliminated rivals with surgical precision. His rise seemed inevitable. At the height of his power, it seemed that he had tamed fortune, but it always takes its toll. In 1503, his father died suddenly, and a new pope, Julius II, took over. Without the support of the church, Cesare was betrayed, imprisoned, and years later, killed in an ambush. The lesson? Virtue can take us far, but no one escapes fortune entirely. The idea that luck influences success may seem frustrating, but Machiavelli didn't see it as an excuse for passivity. On the contrary, he believed that the secret lay in always being prepared for when fortune turns. In business, we see this clearly. Steve Jobs was ousted from Apple in 1985, but instead of resigning, he continued to innovate until, years later, he returned to rebuild the company and turn it into the empire we know today. That's virtue. On the other hand, companies that dominate the market but don't adapt to change end up destroyed by fortune. Nokia and Kodak are classic examples of giants that fell because they relied too much on luck and neglected strategic action. If fortune is unpredictable, how can we protect ourselves from it? Machiavelli offers a simple piece of advice: treat luck like a flowing river. You may not be able to prevent a flood, but you can build dams and canals to minimize the damage when it comes. This means being prepared, learning, adapting, and never relying on a single path to success. Those who expect circumstances to always be favorable end up being destroyed when the tide turns. The combination of virtue and fortune separates the winners from the losers. But there is a third element that can define who really stays on top: the ability to control perceptions and the narrative. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next chapter. The truth matters less than what people believe. Machiavelli realized this by observing rulers who fell not because of their faults, but because of the way those faults were perceived. He understood that power does not belong to those who act correctly, but to those who know how to shape their image and control the narrative. This idea was especially true in Renaissance Florence, but it applied to all European politics. Louis XIV, the Sun King, dominated France for more than 70 years, not only because of his political and military strategies, but because he built up an image of absolute authority. He turned his reign into a spectacle of grandeur, centralizing power around himself and convincing nobles and commoners that his existence was almost divine. By creating the Palace of Versailles and concentrating the nobility in his court, he ensured that no one questioned his supremacy. Control of the narrative was his greatest weapon. Napoleon Bonaparte followed the same path. He understood that an army marched not only by force or discipline, but also by faith in his leadership. His speeches before battles made his soldiers believe that they were fighting for a greater cause, and even when he was exiled, he managed to transform his image from tyrant to martyr. When he escaped from the island of Elba, he reconquered France without firing a single shot. It wasn't brute force, it was pure manipulation of perception. This strategy is not restricted to politics. In the corporate world, companies build brands that appear ethical and innovative, while behind the scenes they operate ruthlessly. Disney sells itself as a symbol of magic and happiness, but throughout its history, it has strategically and brutally eliminated competitors. Apple cultivates the image of creativity and freedom while maintaining a tightly controlled production system. Reality may be harsh, but the way it is presented defines who retains power and who loses it. Machiavelli knew that controlling perceptions doesn't mean lying all the time, but rather understanding that people react more to what they feel than to what they know. Respect, admiration, and even fear are managed through the image that a leader projects. A ruler can be cruel as long as his cruelty seems necessary. He can be manipulative as long as his manipulation seems like justice. In the game of power, truth is malleable, and those who understand this govern those who do not. But this manipulation has a limit. The mistake many leaders make is thinking they can sustain a lie indefinitely. The key is not just to control the narrative, but to know when to change strategy to prevent reality from destroying the illusion. This brings us to a crucial question. Is power best sustained by love or fear? If perception is controllable, which of the two images guarantees more stability? This is the next question Machiavelli forces us to answer. Machiavelli had no illusions about human nature. He knew that people change loyalties according to their interests, and that love is an unstable emotion. A ruler can be loved today and betrayed tomorrow. Fear, on the other hand, when well managed, generates respect and predictability. That's why he asked one of the most uncomfortable questions in the history of politics. Is it better to be loved or feared? The answer he offers is not comfortable, but it is clear. It is safer to be feared than loved. However, there is one crucial caveat. Fear must be controlled, calculated. If a leader becomes hated, he awakens conspiracies and enemies who will destroy him. The secret is to command respect without crossing the line into hatred. History is full of examples of leaders who failed because they trusted only in the love of their followers. Louis XVI of France believed that his popularity was enough to keep him on the throne. But when the winds changed, he was abandoned and guillotined. Nicholas II of Russia tried to rule based on the devotion of the people, but his indecision and lack of enforcement made him an easy target for revolution. Both were loved, but that didn't save them. On the other hand, leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Otto von Bismarck built their authority not by seeking popular approval, but by commanding respect. Thatcher faced strikes, crises, and massive opposition, but she governed firmly and consolidated her power. Bismarck unified Germany with aggressive diplomacy and force, and was feared by his rivals and even his allies. Time has shown that those who command respect survive longer in power. In the business world, the same principle applies. Steve Jobs was not a beloved boss. He was demanding, perfectionist, and merciless with mistakes. Employees feared his criticism, but the result was the creation of revolutionary products and a culture of excellence. Companies that try to be too nice, giving in to any pressure, end up becoming weak and vulnerable. Personal life also reflects this dynamic. Parents who try to be just friends with their children often lose authority. Teachers who seek popularity in the classroom often fail to maintain discipline. Bosses who want to be adored end up being disrespected. The balance lies in setting clear limits without becoming tyrannical. The mistake many leaders make is not choosing between love or fear, but not understanding that each situation requires different approaches. Love can be useful for creating connections, but fear ensures that these connections are not broken at the first opportunity. The ideal, according to Machiavelli, is to be loved and feared at the same time. But if you have to choose one, security lies in the respect that well-managed fear can provide. Even so, fear and respect are not enough to maintain power. To truly guarantee stability, a leader needs to master something even more difficult: the art of decisive action. when to act, when to wait, and when to strike without hesitation. This is Machiavelli's next great secret. Machiavelli knew that power never belongs to those who wait passively. In the game of life, hesitation is weakness. He who acts decisively dominates. Those who hesitate lose. Alexander the Great understood this from an early age. On his campaign through Asia, he encountered a problem that no one had managed to solve before: the Gordian knot. According to legend, whoever untied that knot would become lord of all Asia. Many people patiently tried to untie it, analyzing its threads and looking for a logical solution. Alexander wasted no time. In a single stroke of his sword, he cut the knot in half. Instead of playing by the established rules, he created his own. That's the difference between those who make history and those who are forgotten. The world doesn't reward those who wait for the perfect moment. It favors the daring, those who take risks and make things happen. In the movies, this principle is represented by the character of Walter White in Breaking Bad. At first, he was an ordinary man, an underrated chemistry teacher who hesitated to take charge of his own life. But as he becomes Heisenberg, he learns to act without fear. He makes brutal decisions, eliminates competitors before they become threats, and takes full control of his destiny. The morality of the journey may be questionable, but the lesson is clear. In the real world, the hesitant are crushed. Jeff Bezos has applied this same principle to business. In the early 2000s, Amazon was not yet a giant, and Bezos realized that digital commerce was the future. He didn't wait for the perfect moment. He didn't ask the market for permission. He invested heavily in structure, logistics, and technology, making aggressive decisions before his competitors. Today, Amazon defines global e-commerce. On the other hand, those who hesitate too long end up being devoured. In the Godfather trilogy, there is a fundamental difference between Michael Corleone and Fredo, his brother. Fredo always had a chance to prove himself, but his indecision and fragility made him expendable. Michael, on the other hand, has understood that leadership requires coolness and quick action. When the decisive moment arrives, he does what needs to be done. This logic applies to any area of life. How many opportunities have been wasted for fear of taking action? How many times has someone failed to say what they needed to, missed a crucial moment, or seen someone else take what could have been theirs? Machiavelli didn't say that we should act impulsively. On the contrary, action must be strategic, but also ruthless. The biggest mistake is not making the wrong decision. It's not making a decision at all. But acting quickly is not enough. Great strategists don't just make bold decisions. They know who to trust and when to be wary. Many leaders have fallen not for lack of action, but because they let the wrong person get close. And that is Machiavelli's last great teaching. Trust is one of the most dangerous weapons in the game of power. Machiavelli understood that danger rarely comes from declared enemies, but rather from those who are too close. The fatal error of many leaders was not a lack of strength or strategy, but the naivety of believing that they were surrounded by genuine loyalty. Julius Caesar learned this the hard way. Among all the senators who plotted to assassinate him, one of them was Brutus, someone Caesar considered an ally. At the moment of the blow, when he saw Brutus among his executioners, his resistance broke. "Even you, Brutus?" Those were his last words. The betrayal came not from without, but from within. In the Game of Thrones series, Eddard Stark represents this classic mistake. An honorable but naive man. He trusted that truth and justice would be enough to protect him. He ignored the signs of betrayal all around him and ended up beheaded. The game of power does not reward the righteous, but the vigilant. History is full of examples of how blind trust can lead to ruin. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in a scheme in which even government agents were involved. Napoleon was betrayed by one of his generals at the most critical moment of his campaign. And even modern companies have gone bankrupt because they trusted partners and investors who stabbed them at the first opportunity. But then, how do you navigate a world where anyone can be a potential traitor? Machiavelli doesn't suggest blind paranoia, but rather strategic distrust. Trust, but always test. Have allies, but never depend totally on anyone. Keep secrets, but never expose your plans completely. In the movies, a character who represents this perfectly is Thomas Shelby from the Peaky Blinders series. He knows that betrayals can come from anywhere and never puts his fate completely in someone else's hands. He trusts, but never without a contingency plan. And that's what keeps him alive and in control. Machiavelli's final lesson is clear. It's not about never trusting, but never trusting without control. Power does not belong to the naive, but to those who understand human nature and know how to play with it. But here, a nagging question arises. Was Machiavelli really as cold and calculating as people say? For centuries, he has been interpreted as an advocate of cynicism and cruelty. But what if his real lesson is something very different? Perhaps everything we know about Machiavelli is wrong, and that's the last piece of the puzzle. Machiavelli has been labeled as a villain, as the father of manipulation, as the architect of betrayal. For centuries, his writings have been interpreted as a handbook for tyrants, a guide for those who wish to gain power at any cost. But what if it's all a mistake? The greatest irony about The Prince is that many have read it as a book about domination, but few have realized that it is actually a book about survival. Machiavelli wasn't saying that the world should be cruel. He was merely warning that the world was already cruel, and ignoring that doesn't make anyone nobler, just more vulnerable. The weak believe that it is enough to do the right thing for good to triumph, but history shows otherwise. Righteous rulers have been overthrown by conspiracies. Innovative companies have been destroyed by giants who knew better. Talented people were trapped in mediocre lives while the most cunning rose to the top. Machiavelli didn't invent the rules of this game. He just had the courage to lay them out. But does that mean we should be cold, strategic, and ruthless all the time? This is the mistake of many who try to apply The Prince literally. Machiavelli's real lesson is not be cruel. It's know when to be. It's not manipulate everything around you. It's understand how others try to manipulate you. It's not destroy your enemies without mercy. It's don't hesitate when you need to defend yourself. Machiavelli's genius was in making us see reality without filters. He didn't want you to be a piece in other people's game. He wanted you to understand the rules and know how to play. The question is not whether the world should be different. The question is, are you ready to face the world as it really is? Life isn't about winning or losing. It's about not being so naive as to be defeated without even realizing it. This means knowing when to trust and when to back down, when to speak up and when to shut up, when to give in and when to be ruthless. Machiavelli was not a monster. He didn't teach evil for evil's sake. He just wanted no one to be crushed by a world that doesn't forgive the unprepared. And in the end, his message isn't about being cruel, it's about being strong enough not to have to be. The question that remains is, what will you do with this knowledge? And remember, knowledge is the path to true freedom. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.